monitoring my email in case there's any news, but I can't see anybody trying to contact me on that. So yeah.
And Neil
Sullivan is here. I think
Maria
is one of the first ones to get here.
Okay.
Yeah.
And Jeffrey just here. Phil Howard?
Phil Howard, yeah, there he is. PhD, that is Phil Howard.
Right, okay. Yeah.
Everybody's going for the cool nickname today.
I'm sorry, I didn't.
No, me neither. Right, so let's wait for Kirsten to.
Okay, I think. Okay, I am just going to check to make sure that it's working. 1 second. Just give me a sec.
Yeah, sure.
1 sec.
Okay, so Kirsten, just to give you a heads up, and Sarah, Neil Sullivan has just had his computer powered down, so he's rebooting it at the moment, and we'll be joining us any minute now. Yeah.
Okay, we appear to be going, so I think we can start, and I'm going to start the recording.
Yeah.
And I'll continue to let people in. When we hit capacity, I will direct people to the live streaming link.
So the only person really to look out for here is, as we said, Neil Sullivan. So hopefully he will make an appearance soon. All right. Do you mind if I stop monitoring the waiting room now?
Yeah, that's fine. That's fine.
Okay, perfect. All right, I'm going to close that then. All right, brilliant. So I'm going to make a start. And hopefully we won't have more hiccups with the technology. But this is a very 2021 kind of experience, I suppose. So, it's part of the authenticity of the event. So welcome everyone to the launch of the Canterbury Sound in Popular Music, Scene, Identity and Myth. So here is the book. It actually got here yesterday, so better the day before than the day after. I am very, very pleased about that. So I've had the incredible privilege and pleasure to co-edit this book together with Shane Blackman, based at Canterbury Christchurch University, and Andy Bennett, who has joined us today from Griffith University in Brisbane. So it's the middle of the night, but we also have other people who are in all sorts of funky time zones, such as contributor Mengyao Jiang, who has joined us from Tsingtao today in China. So I'm very glad from some perspectives that we are online, because it means that we can have this opportunity to meet across the different time zones. And so today's event will include us, the three editors, me, Shane and Andy, and the discussion will be led by Dr. Sarah Hale, who is an associate professor of popular music at Oxford University. We are also joined by a number of our wonderful book contributors. So thank you all for turning up. And yeah, I'm very, very happy to see you, even though, of course, I would love that to be happening personally as well, as in live. So for me, this is a personally and professionally important moment. So I went to Canterbury for the first time in the distant 2008. And I was attracted by the prospect of studying media and cultural studies, but also I was attracted by the image of a place, looking all very beautiful. I sort of began to romanticize this place before I had ever visited it. And I think those images of Canterbury, and maybe Chaucer's Canterbury Tales may have helped a bit, had stimulated a sense of imagination of the place. And I think that there is a similarity there with the music and some of the themes today we're going to discuss around the link with geographical place, but also the myths that we create around it. So I met Shane through my BA there, and later on he became my PhD supervisor. And during my PhD, of course, I met Andy Bennett. So as it turned out, he had also lived in Canterbury at some point in his life. So we could probably say that Canterbury is indeed the common ground for this academic friendship and for this academic collaboration. Towards the end of the PhD, I started working on this project, which is around music scenes in a heritage and university city of Canterbury. And the theme around the Canterbury Sound, or the Canterbury scene, as many of us might refer to it, emerged quite naturally from conversations with musicians. So this really was the beginning of establishing of a Canterbury Sound network, which is indeed what led to today's event, but also, of course, to the publication of the book that we're talking about. But what is the Canterbury Sound? I know that most of you are probably quite aware of it. It's a signature style in popular music. It links to progressive rock, to jazz, to psychedelic music. And some of the key artists include Caravan, Soft Machine, Gong, of course, Kevin Ayers, Robert Wyatt, David Allen. And it all emerged in the 1960s from, well, what we may think of as quite a legendary band called the Wildflowers. And all of that did indeed happen in Canterbury. But as the sound evolved, it really became quite removed from place. So that connection, while it had a geographical core, also became symbolic and mythologized connection with place. So Andy Shane and I in 2017 organized an event called Canterbury Sound, Music, Place and Myth, which was a series of talks, a series of gigs. DIY archivists showed their work at that and their collections. It was quite an international event. And for many people who turned up to that, the Canterbury Sound or the Canterbury scene had been a lifelong fascination and an interest, but they had never actually indeed visited Canterbury. So we thought that this indeed reflected how this, mythologies and discourses around place are constructed through music and how we imagine place through it. So why is this important? From the 2017 event, something which became captured is that sense of a legacy of the Canterbury scene, which is around artistic freedom, experimentation, innovation, humor, all this genre-defying openness. And I think this is what allows for the Canterbury scene to be an intergenerational phenomenon, which of course attracts contemporary musicians such as Siddhartha and Lapis Lazuli. And we've got Neo from Lapis Lazuli joining us today, who contributed to the book. So bringing this back to the BCMCR, who are hosting this book launch event, and our annual theme, Alternativity, which I'm coordinating together with my colleague Charlotte Stevens. The Canterbury Sound is alternative in multiple different ways. So from one hand, even though it's got a very committed following, it never has been, or probably never will be, a form of mainstream. On the other hand, it's also, an alternative heritage. That's another way of conceptualizing how the Canterbury Sound connects to this sense of alternativity. And finally, of course, this edited collection on the Canterbury Sound is indeed formulated in an alternative approach. It's not necessarily dominated by academic research, but rather than that, we've got writing from musicians, journalists, DIY archivists, fans, producers. It's quite a broad range of people who wouldn't necessarily identify themselves as researchers or writers. So I would like to, offer my thanks at this moment, particularly to Brian Hopper, who is with us today, for letting us use this beautiful image of Canterbury Cathedral, drawn by his father, Leslie Thomas Hopper. Yeah, I think it really captures something special about Canterbury as a place in its spirit. And I would also like, before we start with the discussion with Sarah, to kind of mention somebody very important who isn't with us today. This is Rick Chaffin, who sadly passed away before the publication of the book. And I would like to offer our acknowledgement and thanks for his contribution, which described Canterbury's paths through the United States, as he was involved with organizing a bunch of very significant gigs and opportunities for Canterbury Sound musicians in the US. So finally, this is not the end of the road, I hope, for the Canterbury Sound research, in which I hope to continue to be involved, because the Arts, Design and Media Archive here at Birmingham City University has acquired the complete Phil Miller collection. So Phil Miller is a key Canterbury Sound figure who participated in bands like Hatfield in the North, National Health, Matching Mole. So this involves studio music, tapes, scores, CDs, LPs, magazines, flyers, posters, photos, anything you can imagine. And our colleague Pedro Cravino is with us today. He's the keeper of the ADM archives, and he can probably answer some questions about the Phil Miller archive later. So now I'm going to hand over to Sarah Hill, And hopefully, if any of you have any questions, you can post those in the chat on the Zoom meeting or as comments using the YouTube stream. Okay.
Great, thank you, Asya. It's a real pleasure to be here, and it's been a real pleasure to read the book. So thank you for the advanced copy. I don't have a hard copy to show you. A PDF doesn't really do it. So just congratulations to everybody, all the contributors, for a really enjoyable read. I have to kind of dodge the sun here for a second. I've sort of gone through the book and thought about ways of clumping people together into ideas and thoughts to try to spark a little bit of a conversation. We don't have very much time, so forgive me if I cut you off unceremoniously at some point. What I wanted to do is sort of work my way through the book. There are 5 parts to the book, and they all kind of overlap in very interesting and different sorts of ways. But if I can start with the opening part, which is where Andy Bennett, Brian Hopper, and Murray Smith come in, because in the first part, they really set out the ideas about the emergence and the sound and the scene itself. So you talk about, particularly Andy sets out to explain the Canterbury Sound as a local, a translocal, and a virtual scene. And that's an idea that kind of carries right across the collection. So if I can get Andy to sort of riff on that for a minute or two. Brian Hopper gave a really clear historical overview of the Canterbury Sound and the Canterbury scene. And then Murray Smith brings in Brian Eno's idea of scenius. So there's a big question about why call it a scene, why call it a sound? So between the 3 of you, maybe I can start some fireworks popping. So I'm going to hand it over to Andy.
Thanks, Sarah. The idea really of the virtual scene came literally from being in Canterbury, beginning to talk to some people organically on the street in shops about the Canterbury Sound. And at that time, we're talking here almost 20 years or 22 years ago now, when I was doing that work. And there was this kind of interest, this bubbling kind of enthusiasm for Canterbury, but it was a sort of thing that, you know, it happened a long time ago and it's not really current now. And of course, the internet in those days was also a very kind of early stage of development in terms of, you know, the way that music is represented now. That we didn't have Facebook, you know, it was definitely Web 1.0. But I did find Amaric Leroy's site, you know, the Calyx site. And really the idea just got into my head from there about the idea of the scene as something which was kind of projected back onto the city through all of these sorts of, I wouldn't call them romanticized. I think that's to underplay the Canterbury Sound, but definitely a sort of a notion of something going on, which is projected, as I say, thought through by people who weren't in the city. They were kind of around the world and talking to each other about this thing. So that was the kind of the genesis of that idea of the virtual scene. And I think that the paper that I wrote at that time on Canterbury introduced that notion of virtual scene for the first time. So then it took on a life of its own as a kind of an academic mouthpiece for talking about all kinds of different things. But I think in terms of Canterbury, it still has this very, very sort of specific notion, because one thing that really hit home to me when I met Asya and, you know, realized that she and Shane were doing this wonderful work on Canterbury, was that this thing had really picked up, you know, all of these people still talking about Canterbury and reflecting on it and filling out, sort of backfilling, I suppose, all those scene qualities that had been dormant for a long time. So, and then the translocal thing came from a different angle. That was myself and the late Richard Peterson, lovely man, great sociologist, who said, you know, maybe this is a good way of thinking about the you know, how the virtual and the kind of the local connect through these kind of translocal flows, which also, of course, include physical visitations to Canterbury and the kind of contemporary pilgrimage to look at where, you know, great things have happened. And to me, I think that was the essence of it. And a lot of great things in music happen in small spaces, you know, in kind of fairly, I wouldn't say Canterbury's peripheral, but it's, you know, it's not the kind of the epicenter that a lot of music cities would be. And so that just seemed like a nice way of framing it. So when, as you're asked if I kind of work, you know, in the book, that was my immediate thought, to revisit those three ideas and just to bring them all together in an essay. So, you know, that's the basis of it, really.
You've mentioned sort of the idea of the conversation, not only between people who were there at the time, but between generations, and also between people from outside and people from inside. And that's certainly something that gets visited in the collection as well. Can I just turn to Brian and ask a little bit about the kind of historical thing, and how much of your idea of the historical narrative of the Canterbury scene actually kind of chimes with what you just heard Andy say about, you know, the idea of it being virtual, or the idea of it being, you know, kind of an historical moment. Unmute yourself. Yeah.
Right. I think for those of us who grew up in Canterbury, I mean, most of us involved in the early musical expeditions, if you like, were all at school together. In my case, Mike Ratledge and I were contemporaries, both at primary and secondary school. And several of us then went on to the Simon Langton Grammar School for Boys. And really, there was a lot of encouragement, both there and also from things that we were doing ourselves at home, listening to music of various kinds. I mean, Mike and I were very much into 20th century classical music, ethnic music and other things, as well as multimedia aspects. So there was a wide range of influences going on. And we were playing together in various sort of combinations, sort of free jazz, some of it was sort of semi-classical stuff. But eventually all these things came together, and we decided at one point that we wanted to become more into the popular mainstream of music as it was becoming in the early to mid 60s. So that's really was the foundation of the Wildflowers, which included people like Robert Wyatt, Kevin Ayres, my brother Hugh, and Richard Sinclair. They were the first people who were in the band, and it carried on. There was various iterations of the band over the next 3 or 4 years. I mean, it changed a bit, but there was always a core of people there, and we slowly developed our style. Most of our gigs and so forth were actually composed of not only of covers of popular music at the time, blues, rock and roll, etc. But we were writing a lot of our own material, which had been really inspired by some of our earlier sort of activities. And so that was very unusual for a local band at that time. I mean, most people who were around, there were lots of other local bands in the Canterbury area, but they were just playing sort of covers of the hits of the day, if you like. But we were trying to form a new path, really. Not that we were trying to define ourselves in a sort of wonderful way as the Canterbury scene innovators, but I think it came out of the fact that we were trying to do different things with our music and our other interactions.
I think it's a little too easy for people, I think, to look at a place, a single place where there was a huge production of different kinds of music, and assume that everybody was influenced by the same things, or was listening to the same music, or had the same interests. So I think you show, certainly in your chapter, that that's absolutely not the case, and that you're talking about a broad spectrum of musical influence right from the start. And it reminds me of scenes that kind of bubble up in other places that might be a little bit off the map.
Yep.
Where it just happens that there's a core, as you say, of individuals who are working toward doing something new and doing something different for the sake of making music that they want to listen to.
Yeah, I quite agree, and I think this sort of aspect has been repeated in other places with other people at different times. It's not unique, I don't think. It's just that somehow this handle of the Canterbury scene or the Canterbury Sound has been put on it, partly because I think from the early days of the Wildflowers, of course, quite a few internationally, as they became, recognised bands and musicians came out of that, directly spawned from those early beginnings. And people then look back at the origins, and there was a bit of mythology going on around it because, of course, at the time we didn't actually make any recordings of the Wildflowers. We only made a few demos, which were later issued as a CD. But it became a bit of a mythology, and particularly journalists, I think, cottoned onto this as a sort of rather interesting or fascinating aspect of the whole thing. But that's really where the Canterbury scene and the Canterbury Sound came from.
So there, you're kind of touching on the idea that if you were there, you would know how great the music was live, and it was the stuff that got put on record that was the least interesting. I mean, it's sort of the same kind of mythology that gets thrown around about a lot of 60s music and a lot of 60s kinds of scenes, where the live event was really what people associate with it, not so much what's put on record.
Yeah, that's quite right. Yes, yes, indeed.
Murray Smith. I'm just looking at a sea of squares.
Yeah, I'm here. I'm here.
There you are.
Yeah, guilty as charged.
This how do you sort of square what Brian says about the core of core group of individuals and the wide ranging musical influence and graft Scenius onto it?
Okay, well, let me sort of work my way to Scenius, if I can, through just one other kind of issue, which I think might be of interest, and which, as I sat here, kind of a phrase came to mind, which kind of captures what's been in my mind all along. So, I mean, just biographically, to start with, I mean, I was listening to Canterbury scene bands, as they came to be called, and were called at the time when I was a teenager. So Hatfield and the North were probably my biggest fixation amongst that set of groups as a teenager. But from then on, I listened more and more widely across the various associated acts. So for me, by the time I became an adult, it was like the Canterbury scene was a fixture in my mind. And the idea that, that it was, I'm not saying anyone has said this, but the idea that it was a mere construction, a journalistic fiction, something as strong as that, struck me as an intriguing but alarming idea. And so my starting point for this essay was to kind of look at what I call scene skepticism, right? Which you've heard a little bit of from both Andy and even from Brian there as a participant. And, among the first skeptics were indeed the musicians. So Robert Wyatt is famously leery, right, of, kind of encompassing the musical activity of his early career in terms of the Canterbury labeling. And I came across another example of this just a couple of nights ago when I was sharpening up for today's event. I found my way to watching the, what's it called, Romantic Warriors documentary film from about 2014, 15. There's a 2-hour documentary about the Canterbury scene. Brian is involved as one of the interviewees. And another one of the interviewees in that film is Mont Campbell of the band Egg, who were the kind of City of London branch of the Canterbury scene. Of course, that's already a complication right there, right? And there's two different moments in the interview with Mont Campbell, which I thought were really telling in this connection. So there's one moment where he's saying, so there was this gig where we were thrown into the same lineup with, he's talking about Egg. We were thrown on the same lineup with Soft Machine and, some other Canterbury associated band. And he says, of course, we had nothing to do with each other, so musically whatsoever, just thrown together. And then there's another moment, sort of, I think actually earlier in the documentary, where he describes going into the recording studio to record one of the, I think the first of the Egg albums, and going up to the producer, showing him a copy of the first Soft Machine album and saying, this is what we want to sound like. Right? So there are these two sort of, I'm not being, I hope I'm not coming across as anything but appreciative of Mont Campbell as a musician. My point really is this, is that if you're in the thick of it as a musician, you won't necessarily be in the best position to see the wood, right? You can't see the wood for the trees. So, I mean, the tack I take in my paper is essentially to say there really was a there. There really was a something which eventually got, labeled the Canterbury scene. But it's a complicated thing. It's a really complicated thing. And I think that what Andy and Brian and others talk about in the book is actually the complexity of separating out the pure mythology from the elusive reality of the musical community which formed and developed. And another really striking moment to me in the story is when you get bands like Super Sister from The Hague being adopted as Canterbury scene bands, right? Once you reach that moment, you realize, okay, something really interesting is going on with here. My take on this is simply that it's a musical style. And geography has, in a sense, very, very little to do with the heart of the matter, other than the kind of fact that this is where it began in some important sense. And that's not trivial, but I don't think that, there's a lot to be mined from the kind of larger historical associations of Canterbury necessarily. I've sort of rabbited on about that. Do you want me to say, shall I leave it there, Sarah, or do you want me to say anything on seniors and scene and stuff? I've lost you, Sarah. Your sound is gone.
It's because as a rookie mistake, I just muted myself when I was actually unmuted all along. I'm happy for you to pipe in with Senius as it sort of pops up throughout the way. What you said actually reminded me of something that Andy Bennett has written about elsewhere, which is the idea of a mythscape. So it's not even so much that bands want to get associated with a specific place, but with the idea of a place. So that's kind of one way of thinking about it as well. The idea that the city boundaries of a place like Canterbury can extend as far as The Hague is pretty fabulous. I mean, let in whoever wants to be there, I guess.
And one of the other things, I mean, many of you will have seen, I guess, this Romantic Warriors film, which is, it's not a perfect film, but it's got a lot of nice features. And another one is its international, its attention to the spread of the scene and maybe we should say the idea of the scene as much as the scene internationally. So the Super Sister moment is just the first moment. And then, by the time you get to the early 2000s, we're talking, Brazil, Eastern Europe. Brian, I'm sure will know the kind of details of that migration of the, perhaps we should be talking about the Canterbury scene diaspora, the way it kind of like spreads around the globe.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely going from Canterbury out to the globe, but also what happens in the next part of the book, which I'm going to move on to in a minute, is the idea of the people coming into Canterbury with varying levels of awareness of the historical imprint of the music scene. And that's something that Jack Hughes talks about. But before I get to Jack, I wanted to bring Meng Yao in because she's represented much later in the book, but because of time differences, I thought I'd get her to speak up a little bit about what you said in your chapter, Meng Yao, which is Sarah Cohen's idea of the social production of place, which I think is still another way of thinking about what happened in Canterbury. And you wrote about the insider, outsider perspectives in the DIY scene. And and the kind of the intergenerational reality of it. So it's spreading out the idea of music making in this little place to embody not just venues and fanzines and all the rest of it, but also the correspondence, the communication across generations and across genre. Did you want to say anything about that, Mingyao?
Yeah, thanks for putting me earlier in this event. So I was a PhD student of Shane Blackman. So I kind of did this chapter when I was in Canterbury. Also at the same time, I was doing some music with Asia. So kind of like a guitar and piano project. So when I was studying in Canterbury, I was quite involved in the local DIY music scene. So I kind of played in 2 bands like Holistic Medicine and Tinfoil Astronaut. And also I made some like friends with student musicians from University of Kent and Canterbury Christ Church. So as kind of like an insider within this music scene, and kind of did some qualitative research about how students involved in this music scene and the position of the recent Canterbury music scene, like the DIY scene, kind of like very marginal. And also it shares some connections with the Canterbury Sound, because they kind of both kind of in a marginal position in comparison to other major youth cultures. So like during 2014 and 2019, the major youth culture was like clubbing cultures and drug cultures. So not many students got involved in this kind of DIY and independent music scene. So I kind of interviewed lots of student musicians and some owners of record labels to collect some data, and found like Canterbury as a place both facilitate the production of music, because it kind of inspired musicians to produce very authentic and original music, kind of with diverse music styles like shoegaze, like punk, and some metal music. But at the same time, Canterbury as a place which kind of always associate with the image of like medieval buildings and cathedrals. So kind of like the major population might be more interested in kind of formal art or high art. So which kind of make the development of the independent alternative music scene a bit more difficult. Also, the local residents might want to have a quieter nightlife. So when they perform in big in venues, they always have to be restricted. Yeah, that's basically my views in these chapters.
It's you've raised a lot of very different points there than the sorts of things we've been talking about before, because you're talking about a very specific genre with very specific kind of codes and rules to live by. And one of the things that I get from the other chapters, or one of the main sort of messages from the other chapters, is not about restriction, but rather about freedom. So it's not a restriction in the way that you can perform or in the way that you can express yourself musically, or about who your audience is. Whereas I get that sense from the DIY culture that they're very strict rules to play by.
Yeah, especially some of my musician friends, they were quite ambitious, and they really want to develop a career out of playing bands, but they feel it's kind of like really difficult to establish a musical career in Canterbury. Even like some surrounding places like Margate or Brighton or Ramsgate have a more lively music scene than Canterbury in terms of venues and like the circle of musicians. So some of them kind of want to move to London to really establish a music career.
It's the way it's always been, though, isn't it? You go off to London to make your name. I wonder if I can bring Jack and Richard Dove in here, because between the two of you, you had biographical and autobiographical approaches to your contributions to the collection. So you're thinking about Canterbury not only as an historical place, but also as a present musical reality. So Jack, I was interested in the way you started off by saying didn't know a thing about the Canterbury Sound.
Yeah.
So it was a process of education along the way.
Yeah, it was. Yeah. I mean, as a kid, I grew up listening to prog bands, I suppose, but mainstream. So Yes and Genesis. And then very briefly, when it came to me having a career, this was the era of punk and so on. So the idea of a British band being influenced by jazz or trying to write a song that lasted 8 minutes was out of the question, you know. So I found myself on this very different sort of journey with my band Wang Chung, and of course I effectively moved to America for my career there, you know. So when I got to Canterbury, I'd sort of lost touch with the idea of prog and all of that stuff, you know. But I met Sam Bailey, who's someone who's not around on this, but he really should be, because Sam has sort of affected the current Canterbury scene in very powerful ways, you know. But he actually at that time was giving my daughter piano lessons. So I got to sort of hang out with him, and to cut a long story short, he used to come to my house and we sort of played jazz stuff together, because I was getting very interested in jazz at that point. And for me, the critical thing about the Canterbury sound scene is the influence of free jazz on the musicians, which is not something that you find in the music of Genesis and Yes and those more, if you like, anglicized kind of bands, you know. And so I was getting very interested in jazz at the time, but couldn't really play it because I'm a sort of rock musician and all the changes are complicated and so on, you know. So I started writing my own stuff. And it was when I was recording some of these, my own compositions with Sam, with my friend Chris Hughes, who's a record producer. And Chris said to me, wow, this all sounds so Canterbury, thinking that we would both understand what that meant. And I was like, well, yeah, we live in Canterbury. He goes, no, Canterbury Sound, Canterbury Scene. It's, you know, the long form, the improvisatory sections, the bits that are written out, the bits that are not. And so that set me off on this kind of exploration. In fact, Chris, as I say in my essay, gave me a CD of Canterbury stuff. So The Egg, The Visit to Newport Hospital was one of the great tracks on that. And Hatfield and the North, blah, blah, blah. All those bands were on it, you know. And I started to get really interested in that, and really found a sort of a whole new realm of possibilities, basically, for combining rock music and jazz to create something quite sort of cogent.
Because it was also a process of learning how to improvise, this sort of getting out of your comfort zone.
Yeah, well, that I've always done as a rock musician, I guess, but it's the sort of more disciplined sense of improvisation that comes with looking at jazz, and a whole different approach to improvisation, really, about not playing, you know, rather than playing all the time, which rock musicians tend to do. You know?
Then does it change your perception of yourself in this continuum of the Canterbury Sound?
It's nice to feel a sense of adoption, in a sense, you know. Yeah, that's very important. I think I was sort of wandering for many years, you know. But Canterbury definitely feels like home, and it's a very sort of nurturing place. Your last speaker is very right that there's nowhere to play here. There never really has been, apart from a brief time in the 2000s when there was a place called Local Hero Records. And I talk about that in my essay. A guy called Chris Hahn, who set up this venue where he specially invited local bands. And this was the time when Sid Arthur and Lapis Lazuli, my band, were all playing. So it was a very vital little scene for a while. So there was a brief, albeit way past the original date, flowering of a Canterbury Sound during the mid 2000s. And
Richard, how does that kind of, where I there you are somewhere. How does that kind of fall into place with your sense of Canterbury as historical place?
Well, you know, I have to take you back to a place called Mansfield, which is near Nottingham, a mining town, textiles and coal. It built its fortune on that rather ill-advisedly, to be honest. And we're a group, and it's 50 years ago, we're a group of school friends, and one of us hears Soft Machine 6 on John Peel, and we all got together and started talking about this music that we were hearing. And we had no idea, and none of us had been to Canterbury at that stage. So it was the sound, not Canterbury bit, it was the sound. And then you remember when we used to pore over these, didn't we? These album sleeves and every name on there, and even the recording engineer and everything else. And in fact, I mentioned this in the chapter because I got this from Oxfam in Nottingham when they were selling secondhand records. And for some reason, they put God Loves You on the cover. So, and it's stamped in the middle as well. So this has been with me for a long time. I think Hugh Hopper, he managed to get away with it. He didn't have a God Loves You with Hugh, so Brian, probably clear there. But we were utterly fascinated by the sounds. And then as we began to make the connections, a group of friends of these musicians that were coming up with something different as far as we were concerned, there was wit and humor there, which we weren't used to. You know, there's very few jokes in Black Sabbath, I find, but Hatfield and the North had loads of them. They had a corridor, and we went down and we heard little extracts from tracks as the door was opened and closed. And we were just loving this, sort of very organized anarchy, if you like. So as far as and then we would all gather in someone's front room, and another album, maybe Caravan or Camel, would come together, and we would look at the cross-referencing of names, and we began to build up a whole family tree, which is all centered around Canterbury. And the sense that we were discovering something together was very, very significant for a group of 15-year-olds who had not. We weren't musicians. We were interested in buying music, and you know, we've all still got. There's a few online now of the people that I was sitting with 50 years ago. We've probably all still got that vinyl as well that we've kept with us throughout our lives. So to us, it was hugely significant that we had a group of people who were trying to do something different that wasn't Deep Purple, that wasn't Led Zeppelin, it was almost defined by what it wasn't rather than what it was. And that was the key for us. We had an entree to a club that we were seeing develop before our eyes.
I like the idea of being defined by what it isn't rather than what it is, because
that was very important.
Yeah, I mean, but that's if a genre or a scene or a sound is defined by the people who listen to it,
yes,
they'll know, well, we like it because it's not that. And you know, not so much I can't really define what the thing is that makes it sound like the stuff that I want to listen to. I just know what it isn't.
Yes, absolutely. Yes.
And you mentioned humor, which is going to come back toward the end when with Asya and Shane. But I'm just going to ask everybody to hold that in their heads for the next sort of 10 or 15 minutes. So Richard mentioned the people on the back of the album covers, and the next section of the book, section 3, is about people, essentially. And we have two Neils, yeah, and Billy. Do we have Jeffrey or Maria? No. So Billy, I know you might not want to say anything. That's completely fine. But I wanted to mention that Billy's chapter is the one that actually mentions Canterbury's ancient tradition of pilgrimage. So it sort of looms in the background. The idea of Canterbury as a site of pilgrimage, but it's not actually sort of said specifically until Billy's chapter, which I thought was really wonderful. And the promise of returning to the Holy Land and the magic it promises. And I think that's kind of a really good way of summarizing how people who approach the scene, who want to sort of get to know the music, think of Canterbury not so much as in the tales, but in, the songs. Neil Saunders and Neil Sullivan have very, very different chapters and very different topics that they talk about. Neil Saunders talks a lot about songwriting style and inspiration in the music of Kevin Ayers. I don't know if you'd like to sort of pipe in and see if there's anything that you want to add to what's already come before, or how you might add to the conversation. There you are.
Yeah, it's very difficult, to pin this down precisely, because I think with the Canterbury scene, the way I see it is that it was kind of spoon-fed to me when I was young. I mean, I was like 8 or 9, and my elder brother, who was already in his mid-teens, was attending gigs in various venues in London where this kind of music and related styles were being played at the time. So I was kind of spoon-fed the very first albums by what were then The Soft Machine, with the definite article, and then not very long afterwards, Caravan. And the handle I've always had on it is that in the first instance for me, Canterbury music is music that has some fairly close connection to The Soft Machine, certainly the earliest lineups of The Soft Machine, and of Caravan. I mean, they're the well springs from which it, that's the source it comes from. And Kevin is related, obviously, well, he was born not far from Canterbury in Herne Bay, and obviously he had strong connections with Canterbury. His mother lived very close to Canterbury. His sister, until fairly recently, lived there as well. So Canterbury's always been a hub in East Kent. So obviously people living in and around East Kent were bound to gravitate towards Canterbury, and Kevin obviously was no exception. But I think it's been pointed out also that a small provincial place like Canterbury, once you become professional, or at any rate you have professional aspirations, it's too small a place to contain your ambitions, and then naturally you're going to gravitate, well, from Canterbury, London is going to be your obvious place to aim towards. So inevitably there's going to be a kind of fairly weak geographical connection, even with the earliest Canterbury bands, because as soon as they became professional, they went to London and used that as their kind of launching pad.
So how would you define then the relationship between Canterbury and London as ideas? I mean,
well, obviously London being the largest city in Europe, anywhere within a sort of 80 or 100 mile radius is bound to be kind of drawn into its orbit in one way or another. I mean, it might be different if you go in the opposite direction, because obviously you've got metropolitan centres like Birmingham, and then beyond that, obviously the Northwest, that have got, that are large enough, that are on a sufficient scale where they can sustain music scenes themselves. I know the West Midlands scene was always a very vibrant scene, easily competed with London.
It's true. It's just how much of the idea of Canterbury were the bands actually proclaiming as they hit the stage?
I don't know how much they were proclaiming, but I think that it's there. And this is not something I can't be kind of, I can't demonstrate it scientifically. It's simply something that I intuit from the music, that the place and its surroundings, the countryside around Canterbury, the spirit of those things has definitely entered into the music in some way. This is all terribly subjective and unscientific, but nevertheless, it's something I very strongly feel, and I don't think I'm alone in that respect.
No, I mean, I think that's absolutely echoing what other people have said already. Is like, we know what it is.
Yeah.
We know what it is when we hear it.
But I mean, if you like, you could say that the kind of raw product that was created in Canterbury was refined in London and then went out into the world, went into much wider circulation.
Yeah.
You could say that London was a kind of distillery for the music. I'm
going to pull the other Neil into into the conversation now. I don't know, Neil Sullivan, if you want to put your camera on or just be a disembodied voice. But you had a much more contemporary perspective in your chapter. And you you had the sort of the best definition of the Canterbury Sound that I think I've read, which you called it a sort of jangly kind of old-time signature, slightly whimsical and kooky flavor to a lot of the traditional Canterbury stuff. So there's like, you're sort of equating this music that you're making with the stuff that had come before, which has this kind of, off-kilter kind of identity to it. I don't know if you want to riff on that at all. If you're there.
I'm not sure what's happening with Neil. Hey, Neil. Sullivan.
Neil Sullivan, if you're there, if you're not, I'll come back to you.
Maybe we'll come back to him in a minute or something. Now, he did say he's having some issues.
Yeah, he was having internet problems.
Yeah,
I still maintain that that's a pretty great description, though.
It is a wonderful description, and I'm just putting in the chat that it's really worth having a listen of this contemporary Canterbury band, actually based in Canterbury, Lapis Lazuli. And it's one of the best things about them, I guess, is that you turn up to a gig and they only play a couple of songs because each of them is at least half an hour long. They like making that joke. So hopefully Neil will come back. Okay, if he does, then we'll let him pipe up. I'll just move to part 4 of the book, which is documenting music practices, and we have Phil Howitt and Alan Payne here. Yes, yeah. Phil, yeah, PhD. Sorry.
Yep.
There you are. So any scene is going to depend on its representation, right? So how do you want to talk about fanzines and publications and how the Canterbury Sound or the Canterbury scene was actually represented in print?
Yeah, I mean, from a personal point of view, I mean, a lot of what Richard said really resonates because I was and still am really primarily a fan. And the point at which I started writing about the Canterbury scene was right at the end of the 1980s, when writing about the Canterbury scene was a pretty, for me anyway, at my age and where I lived in Manchester, was a pretty abstract concept because very few of the musicians appeared to be playing live. The records had sort of dried up, and so when I started writing about the Canterbury scene, it was really as a sort of a historical document. Really, it appealed to my sense of wanting to research history, and for a number of different reasons, one of them being the sort of CD revolution, where a lot of the old albums by people got re-released at the start of the 1990s. The interest in the scene gained quite a lot of momentum. And so what I was doing was really just amusing myself, writing stuff about things that I was interested in, and then unwittingly became one of the focal points for people wanting to find out more about the scene. And then obviously it went on well beyond that in terms of the development of the internet and Aymeric Leroy's brilliant Calyx website and the various newsletters surrounding that. And then obviously now 20, 30 years on, we're in the age of social media where you can find out and debate practically anything in real time. But it certainly wasn't like that 30 years ago. And I think there'd been a period of about 10 years between probably the mid to late 70s and the end of the 1980s, where there was very, very little coverage at all. So, I mean, I think I've read a few things in the book about, the Canterbury scene or the Canterbury Sound or whatever you want to call it being subject to a particular set of circumstances. But I think you could extrapolate a a lot of the developments in terms of people writing and reading about the Canterbury scene across a number of different genres coming out of the late 60s and right through the 70s.
It's a good point. Alan Payne, you probably have some thoughts about the wealth of material that's available to PhD scholars, PhD students researching the Canterbury scene. You know, how would you talk about providing historical overviews about, you know, these venues, these storied places, and the usefulness, I mean, the way that you use the fanzines and the publications in your own research? Unmute.
Beg pardon. It struck me sitting here that I've lived in and around Canterbury for nearly 50 years now. And certainly when I came to Canterbury in the 1970s as a student, just echoing something Phil said, there was no evidence whatsoever of a Canterbury scene, actually. Bands were playing, quite mainstream bands were playing, but there was no particular evidence of bands that were rooted in Canterbury. My research used, as you know, a number of sources, and one of them was the Kentish Gazette, the local paper. And I read every Kentish Gazette for 20 years between 1962 and 1982, which was an education of itself. And one of the things that struck me was the bands that have become very much part of the mythscape, and we've been obviously talking about those this afternoon, and the disconnect between bands that have not become part of the mythscape. That there is a lot of evidence in the journalism about bands, mainstream bands, bands who were playing covers, bands who were actually quite successful, but whose work has not gone into the mythscape. And that particularly interested me because it kind of proved how subjective the construction of the mythscape is. And I think looking, and obviously that subjectivity is echoed in the magazines, and in particular in the newspapers. And the newspapers tended to be written by young fans, as far as I could see, who were writing about their favorite bands. The larger bands, Soft Machine, Caravan in particular, had by that point, as we know, moved away or were starting in London and didn't actually feature too much in the journalism. So yeah, there was an enormous. So what struck me when I went through these newspapers to start with, it was an enormous treasure trove of stuff, some of which I remembered and some of which I didn't. But how much there was written about bands that we don't talk about now, and how much more was written about bands that we don't talk about now, and we haven't kind of fated this afternoon, than those that we do. And I found that quite interesting. And that's what my chapter is about. The bands that didn't make it, if you like, the ones that nobody still talks about, but the ones, and I interviewed some participants in these bands who played with, you know, big names in serious venues, but are not talked about anywhere else. So I think, yes, the research material that I used was in particular incredibly subjective, but also reflecting what very much went on at the time, and not what we're looking back at.
There's a really delicate balance, isn't there, between, sorry, somebody's raising their hand? Sorry. There's a really delicate balance between what you remember from being there and what you're told in retrospect.
Yeah.
And it does raise the question about what's going to be, how that story is going to continue to be told over the next 20 or 30 years, and where that's going to be represented.
Yes.
I want to move finally to the last section, which is myths and realities on that very topic, and ask Shane and Asya to talk particularly about what they call the unclassifiable Canterbury Sound, but more importantly, their longer sections on the idea of humor in the music of the Canterbury scene, humor and gender and sexism, because that's something that I think needs to be brought out in the open.
Jane, we haven't heard you speak yet, so would you like to start?
I don't know. Do you want to do? Do you want to? Are we supposed to say something about the interviews? Then is that what Sarah's suggesting first?
Yeah, I mean, anything you want to say about the final part? I was not trying to keep you out of the conversation.
No. Do you want to say something about the interviews, just briefly, Asya? Really, but then I'll start on the human gender thing.
Yeah, sure. I'll say a few words. I mean, one of the things that we were trying to achieve with the book was to ensure that we are writing about music a little bit differently. So try to maybe challenge at least a little bit some of the conventions in terms of academic writing, particularly in terms of cultural research in music. So that is replicated by what we've just seen just now in terms of the type of contributions, the different perspectives that people cover as DIY archivists, as DIY journalists, as enthusiasts, as fans, as musicians, and so on. But of course, you can't ask for a standard chapter from all of these different people with different experience and also different style in terms of their writing. So I think for me, one of the elements of the richness of the book is that it allowed for different forms of contribution. Some of them are very personal reflections, and some of them are, I would say, stories. So we have a contribution from Dave Sinclair, for example, who wrote, he did write a chapter, but it was very much a story of his family and its connection to music. And in order to produce that in a more attractive way, he actually got his son to do an entire archival research into the photographic, collection from as early as the beginning of the 20th century. So we've got things like that in the book, really, which are very, very different. And for others, writing wasn't really such a comfortable thing to do. So we actually ended up including some contributions to the book in the shape of interviews. And that is actually a chapter called Ethnographic Conversations in the Field or something like that. We could have come up with a cooler title, I have to say. And within that, we've got Jeffrey Richardson and Pi Hastings, both of them from Caravan. And we've also got Neil Saunders from, Neil Sullivan from Lapis Lazuli, the band. And Maria Sullivan, Colotto, and you might hear here the same surname. Indeed, Neil and Maria are brother and a sister. So continuing in that vein of genealogy associated with Canterbury, with place, with almost musical family, you could say. Anyway, Maria is one of the female participants in the book, and her perspective is very, very interesting because she's also an electronic musician that takes inspiration from the Canterbury Sound and some of those broken chords, broken rhythms, and a very unusual signature sound. So one of our struggles within the book is indeed with issues around gender, around the participation of women in the scene, both in the contemporary terms, where things may be changing, but also in terms of historical aspects as well. So we have tried to incorporate different perspectives in the book, but we certainly feel that times may have been a little bit different. So I'm glad to see from that we've got Ali McLuhan here, who was indeed one of the important members of the early Canterbury scene, and I'm glad to see her present in today's book launch. But Shane and I and Andy, of course, felt like the issue of gender certainly needed to be addressed head on and very early on. So we've done a little bit of that work in the introduction, but then Shane and I picked up on it in more detail in relation to humor, but also subtle and not so subtle forms of maybe we could call it sexism too in the context of the Canterbury Sound. So Shane and I developed this chapter together, but I would really like him to say a few more words about it, because I felt like he was the driving force behind some of that textual and discourse analysis around humor in music.
Okay, thanks, Amy. Actually, and welcome to everybody this great afternoon. Just to go back to those interviews momentarily, it was actually quite a wonderful interview with Dave Sinclair by the river, and also the interview with Jeffrey, which is still living memories for me. Now, yeah, academics such as Asya and myself, now academics love theory. And this is one of the key things that academics like to do. And in writing this chapter, we were really concerned with actually moving beyond history and moving beyond description of the Canterbury Sound and Canterbury scene. And so one of the key things that we decided to investigate was the place of humour and gender within the Canterbury scene. And one of the things that really drove us there was this whole thing about Alfred Jarray's idea of the mischievous imaginary. And we thought this idea is actually quite a good umbrella term to link in three of the key bands that we wanted to talk about, which are Soft Machine, Gong and Caravan. So the idea of the mischievous imaginary ties into the humour and to the idea of the absurd. And so this meant that we were trying to bring out different aspects of understanding Soft Machine, Gong and Caravan, because we wanted to put some of the ideas that Robert Wyatt suggested quite early on about fun as a sort of central and mischievous element to it. And of course, what we did was actually research the whole relationship of pataphysics and male sexual control within Soft Machine and the sort of imagery that was often used. Here we are, one bottom, and there's the other side. And so with that pataphysics and male sexual control, and then move that through with Gong and the whole idea of the worship of the goddess, and then link it in to Caravan's superb, what we called subversive postcards, which are sort of linked in with sexual innuendos. So we got a gender strand and linking through with that element of humor and this key idea of the mischievousness, because the whole point about these Canterbury bands is to disturb. And so what we tried to do then is say, well, let's look at gender, and we see, as already been spoken, there's a sort of, within the musical artists in the Canterbury scene, there's a sort of absence. So they're sort of invisible, but there are some key figures in certain parts of the bands. But what we see as well is that women, or the female, is actually central to all of these bands. So they become a central muse. And that muse is actually also firing the imagination. And you can see that in Caravan's work around Waterloo Lily. You can see that within Gong and the whole, dare I say it, the worship of the pussy. And so what we see is that women are central as a muse within the Canterbury scene, but at the same time, they do get objectified. And so it's in this critique of the objectification of women within many of the songs and many of the titles, but it's also driven with a sort of a form of humor. So it's that interplay, humor, objectification, and then the reversal. But at the same time, we definitely see that there's this absence, the sort of female invisibility. So there's a real living contradiction there in that the muse is central, but the participation of the female artist is actually sort of nearly absent. So that was the key driver for us to try to think about theories related to humor and theoretical ideas related to gender, and try to fuse them so we can actually move the debate around the Canterbury scene, the Canterbury Sound, in just a slightly different direction. So what you could say is that as academics, we were we were driven by theory in many ways, but we did explore how it actually relates to all of the albums as well that we actually discussed.
That was thank you, Shane, for the distillation of the very engaging final section. I'm aware we have a Q&A coming up,
Yeah.
but I want to pass it back to Asya, who has some things to show us, apparently.
One thing I'm definitely going to show is how I unmute myself before I actually start speaking, for a change. Okay, so just wanted to show a couple of things, actually. One of them will be shown by Murray Smith. So the book, it is a little bit academic in the sense that probably visuals aren't quite as present as they could be, but one of the really precious things that we've got here, and which connects to a lot of what has been said, is an image called Soft Machinery, which is a Canterbury Scene family tree. And this was actually a work of somebody called Pete Frame. And it was published as part of a Soft Machine compilation released in 1977. And I think Murray has the original fold-out that he can give us a sense of the scope of this incredible family tree.
Yeah, I think you need to let me share.
Oh, right. Okay, sure. So I need to probably turn.
Yeah, I think you can do it on the options on share screen, just to the right. I think you can change that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I need to probably turn you into a sorry. I didn't quite think of this. Kirsten, do you mind making Murray a co-host so he can share his screen? And maybe we can have a look at it then. Yeah. So while we're
okay.
trying to
Okay, it says I'm a co-host, so let me see.
Hey, excellent. You should be able to do it then.
Okay, here we go. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to sort of like reveal this to you zoomed in, all right? So you're going to initially see just a detail, and that's kind of, I think, important. So can you see that, folks? Yeah? Okay, so we're looking at, I guess we're looking at the point of origin, right? Right, so that's kind of at the top of the center of the family tree. And by the way, I'm sure most people present will know about Pete Frame's rock family trees, but they were pervasive in publications like Melody Maker in the 70s. And then there was also later a BBC series, a documentary series, which was inspired by these family trees. Anyway, you can see, this is 1977. Up in the top right-hand corner here, the cornerstone of the Canterbury scene, the wildflowers. So whether it's, to whatever extent this is history or mythology, it was in place well and truly by 1977. Down here, you've got a characteristically little witty comment by Pete Frame. It's all Pete Frame, okay, on Kevin Ayres there. Now I'm going to kind of like zoom out so you can see how astonishing this thing is. Right, so here we go. I've got to kind of recenter it every so often. Hang on. Let me get it all the way out. Are we there yet? Okay, so can you guys see that now? Right, so it's so large and so detailed that, so this appears in Triple Echo, the compilation 97. It's like the inside of the double gate, the double gatefold. So that's how large it is. And even Pete Frame, who now kind of like sells his rock family trees, on the internet, this version of Soft Machinery doesn't exist other than here because he lost the original artwork. So what you're looking at is a scan, a reconstructed scan from Triple Echo. And it's too large for him to easily make reproductions of it. So when he reproduces it himself, he does a kind of abridged version, which cuts out the gong wing. So all you gong fans out there will be horribly outraged by that thought. So the wonder of this is it's the complete thing, or at least his conception of the complete family tree. Anyway, thanks for, I think it's a great thing. And Pete was so generous in letting us have this permission without without charge.
Yeah, that was very, very nice indeed. I feel like for everyone involved in the book, it's been very much a labor of love to a great extent. And also in terms of how the network of people around this book was constructed was very much through taking on opportunities for this research, for these connections and friendships to really snowball from each other. You would notice that the foreword for the book is something which I wrote in working with or in collaboration with Robert Wyatt. And the only reason why I ever met this guy was because I bumped into him on the street in Canterbury, indeed. And I decided that actually this may never happen again. So that's how I met him and Alfie. And there were some very interesting things in the conversations that followed. And a lot of them were very much about reconciliation or rediscovery of the connection between a musician that established himself as such a key name, but at the same time was quite detached from the significance of Canterbury. So again, the book begins with this sense of discovery and rediscovery, and also with taking on a one-off opportunity. So very much, you never know where a project might start from. Hopefully we can have a couple of questions now as we are getting to 1:15. Sarah?
Yeah, just a few minutes for questions. If anybody would like to add a question to the chat function or raise your hand. Nigel, I see you. There was, while we were talking earlier, a question from the YouTube live chat. I'm not sure who will be the best person to answer it, but I'll throw it at you.
I'm sure we'll take it on.
Question is, what strikes me about the foundational members of the scene is the astonishing growth in their musical capability in a relatively short period of time without any formal musical training. Thoughts? That's the question. Thoughts? So would anybody like to pipe up?
Question mark.
Ryan?
Yeah, I think that was not quite true that there was no formal education. Both Mike Ratledge and myself had formal education, I on clarinet and he on piano. So we could read music and all that sort of thing. But, and I think the others, although they didn't have sort of formal education, they sort of, because of all the other influences we had, they soon learnt their craft, if you like. And as we came together and played together, particularly, I mean, the early stages, we were just playing free jazz, basically. So that was a very good way to explore what was in your head and put it into your instruments, if you like. And that went on for quite a while before the Wildflowers were formed, you know, in places like Robert Wyatt's parents' house in Lyddon, the Wellington House. So there was a lot of meeting of minds there, which is where we originally met David Allen, of course. And that was all part of the soup where things got mixed together.
Gumbo. Nigel, you've raised your hand, and then I'll get to the
yes.
chat. Nigel,
okay, good, thank you. I'm actually Murray Smith's brother by 4 years. I didn't even know he was into Hatfield in the North. But I was, so actually I'm an academic. I'm not sure that theory is what I do every day. But organized data sets of a kind. But the observation I want to make was in respect of Jack Hughes's comment suggesting that the Canterbury scene were perhaps more marginal than what I understood to be his statement about mainstream bands like Yes and Genesis. But when I started listening to rock music in about 1971, and I was performing in a classical choir as a teenager in London at the time, and recording as well as playing live concerts. It was very much the case that the Canterbury scene was part of a set of progressive rock modes. And I think that the missing piece of the jigsaw that hasn't been mentioned yet is King Crimson, who were also using jazz modes in a highly competent way. So in many ways, at that point in 1971, Soft Machine were more important than Yes, and Genesis hadn't really properly emerged. So that's what I wanted to say. they were important at that point. The fact that they most, famously Caravan didn't get to tour in America, that was fatal for their fame. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a great point indeed. There were other branches and offshoots to those ways in which jazz and progressive music communicated. So certainly what we may refer to as Canterbury Sound or Canterbury bands are only an aspect of that. But yeah, thanks for pointing out the King Crimson connection. That was great.
I don't know, Jack,
if I could. We shouldn't forget that Soft Machine had a prom to themselves, the proms, the BBC proms, which these days are dominated by classical music, or if it is some other kind of music, then it's sort of a special prom that's shoved off to one side slightly. But Soft Machine had a complete gig to themselves, and there wasn't any special pleading for them or anything. They just were considered to be that significant as musicians and important. That to me is a real high point of the confluence of the different genres of music that were happening around that time. I think that was 1970, but I may be wrong.
That's good. That's a good point. Thank you. There's a question in the chat from Simon Strange who says, I wonder if there is a connection to art schools, especially in relation to conceptual ideas and humor.
Yeah, so we had a good.
And somebody does talk about art school, and I can't remember who talks about art schools. Santa, did you talk about art schools?
I don't necessarily think so. Well, certainly there is a connection to that specific school in Canterbury, the Simon Langton School, which even to this day has, of course, on show the pictures of some important musicians that emerged from the place, but probably the connection isn't quite as concrete as it would be for other music phenomena that we may think of, for example, funk itself. But if anybody is a bit more knowledgeable from in terms of this connection to art schools, I'll be, happy to hear about that. It's an interesting thing to consider.
Well, Phil Howard pointed out that he thinks it was Jeff Richardson. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah.
He does speak about that in his interview. Jeffrey definitely did go to art school.
Yeah.
And he does speak about that in his interview. But he didn't meet anybody from the Canterbury scene in that specific art school. I think there wasn't like a specific art school or a couple of art schools where we could really trace such a concrete connection between the two. But some of the members of what we may think of as Canterbury bands did indeed go to art school.
Is Jeffrey here? He's not here this afternoon.
Jeffrey was supposed to be here, but I can't see him. Jeffrey, if you're here, show yourself.
See, it's those Canterbury scene guys. You just can't trust them, right? So I just wanted to say, since Jeffrey's been mentioned, I had a chat with him about the art school connection, actually, and just to throw out, again, many of you will know this. There's a great book by Simon Frith and Howard Horn. It's like written in maybe the early 90s. It's a long while back.
87.
It's all about the art school rock connection. But the thing that Jeffrey said to me in a conversation, which I thought was kind of interesting, not on the art interpop, that's it, the connection, but he said when he moved from Winchester, which is where he was in art school, right, to Canterbury, and he moved to Canterbury to become a member of Spyro Gyra, who then immediately imploded. He sort of got off the train, and after like one rehearsal, the band fell apart and found himself sort of unemployed as a musician in a new town. He said he immediately hooked up with Caravan, and compared with Winchester, he said there really was a sense of a musical community. It may not have been labeled at that point anything like the Canterbury scene, but comparing what was happening in Canterbury, what was happening in Winchester, not dissimilar towns in many respects, church towns, some college life, etc., etc. He felt a difference, right? So that's just to kind of offer another thought about, how, it's part of the origin story, right? But a reality that he experienced as an incomer you know, like some of those guys from the City of London, like Steve Hillage, who were kind of sucked into the scene, they felt the force when they arrived. And then generations later, it happened to Jack, and he's nodding.
Shall we invite some more questions if anybody has any?
Have about 5 minutes, yeah.
Yeah, we've got another few minutes if there's anything that springs to mind. Andy, you've been so quiet for a while.
It's 3 a.m.
Yeah. Go to bed.
You're doing really well, Andy.
I lost my internet connection for a minute, so yeah. Speaking of what, Azia, what are you thinking in terms of?
Yeah, for me, one of the more kind of personal and interesting elements to the conversations we've had from somebody who now lives in Queensland, Australia, on the beautiful Gold Coast. And once you said to me, if there is one place in the UK that you would come back for, that is Canterbury. So that sort of springs to mind as possibly a nice closure point.
Well, I think it just because of a lot of what has been iterated in this session, that you know that sort of vibrancy aspect of it has really sort of begun to reappear. And when we had your event, or our event, I hadn't been to Canterbury for a number of years, and I
dug out the poster for that.
They did, yeah. And I just thought it was just an interesting sort of moment in terms of that real celebration of a place. And I think that the whole, while one could be cynical about the kind of the heritage movement in popular music in terms of resigning things to the past, another way of looking at heritage is to say that it actually allows things to breathe. And I think the other thing, which is really refreshing, is that with the way that we have music now, is that a lot of the genre snobbery has disappeared. I mean, you know, in the event you had Lapis Lazuli who were playing that music, and you know, when you went through the kind of the punk and the new wave era, it was all, oh, you know, we're not playing 8-minute songs, you know, we're just playing scratchy guitars and, you know, these lyrics, you know, which are really simple and accessible. Not that that was a new thing in itself, but it was just this kind of stance against what was seen as a kind of a limiting aspect of progressive rock or punk rock or whatever you wanted to call it. I think what has been interesting with the heritage movement in popular music is that all of those biases are kind of removed, and it's like, let's actually enjoy and celebrate and, you know, rediscover all this stuff rather than just, you know, let it rot in some kind of genre snobbery vault somewhere. And so, and I thought that the Canterbury Sound event was like a really nice moment of just seeing that come together. And you know, the band that played at the end of the night, you know, with Brian, you know, it's just like this amazing sort of everything, you know, was just on show for the audience, and there was so much passion in that performance. So yeah, you know, I mean, that to me would be the thing. That said, of course, you know, David Allen sort of lived his final days out in Byron Bay, which is also a beautiful place with a musical kind of passion of its own as well, and an amazing beach. So,
Andy, I think if it's okay with you, I think we need to make genre snobbery vault a thing. If that's okay with you, I want to use that. I'll give you a footnote. We have three kind of quick fire questions, if that's okay. First, Andy Wood. Understandably, the Canterbury Sound and scene is discussed in historical terms. Is there a present scene? I think that's a straight yes or no answer.
It's a yes. I'm going to take this on very quickly. Shane was terrified of this question popping up, but I knew it would. And that is represented by bands such as Siddhartha and Lapis Lazuli that are openly associated with something like the Canterbury Sound. but you also, a chapter in the book is about a series of events called Free Range, which are very much about experimentation and connect very well with some of the themes about the legacy of Canterbury Sound we've spoken about: humor, experimentation, open-mindedness, defying genre, and so on. So these are some of those elements of what I may refer to as a contemporary Canterbury Sound or scene. Certainly there has been some continuation, I would say. Another element to that is the Psychedelic Society, hosted by the University of Kent, and also a series of events called the Crash of Moons, which is administered by Adam Brodigan from Lapis Lazuli. And there is a chapter about that in the book as well. So one of our sections is indeed about the contemporary scenes within Canterbury. So I do believe it's still happening, guys. It's not the same, but it's still happening.
So next quickfire question from Coalizione Civica to everyone. Well, actually to Stephen. Do you consider Henry Cow within the scene?
Nobody's written about that in the book itself.
No,
yeah.
Georgie Bourne gets mentioned as a member of Henry Cow.
Well, Henry Cow is also linked to Fred Frith as well. And so that would be linked into the Canterbury scene.
Yeah, and I mean, when I was again watching that Romantic Warriors documentary about the Canterbury scene the other night, what's his name? Chris, the drummer of Henry Cow, Chris Cutler. Chris Cutler appears talking about Robert Wyatt's drumming and what an influence Robert Wyatt's drumming was on his drumming. So I think there's definitely interconnections. I mean, I think the tricky question is, which we're not going to answer now because these are quick fire questions, is you could carry on with, you know, your Pete Frame style family tree and keep on mapping it out, right? The interconnections, which, you know, would eventually take you to Henry Cow and that network of bands. But then the question is, on what grounds do you draw some lines? You know, how do you make the decision that this is one family tree and this is a distinct family tree, even if there's been a little bit of talk, right, as there's bound to be between these different families. I would think of Henry Cow as distinct musically because, very roughly speaking, they have a hardcore commitment to atonality, basically a hardcore commitment to early 20th century classical music and jazz and the way they build that into that music. And that's not a value-laden point. It's just saying that I think the way they bring those influences together ends up with something that sounds different, even if there are those important connections. Maybe Brian has a thought.
Well, those connections in the chat as well. So Brian, sorry.
Phil has just put up a little thing about Henry Cow and the connections with O Moscow, Lindsay Cooper, and my brother Hugh. And in fact, Chris Cutler also played with Hugh and David Allen in Brainville. So there's a lot of cross mixing and association with a lot of the musical style as well.
Well, I think people are starting to get less and less shy as we have actually run out of time. I just want to thank Sarah for doing such an amazing job with hosting this conversation and with the amazing prompts and questions, and for reading the book so carefully. And also special thanks to Kirsten, my colleague Kirsten Forkert, who has done a great job also with the organization of the event and making sure that everybody who wanted to attend was able to, thanks to the live stream as well. Yeah, thanks everyone. And I'm really hoping that there will be probably more opportunities to talk about the book, maybe in person and maybe even in Canterbury. We have indeed been invited to do a free range event as part of that contemporary Canterbury scene we mentioned earlier. So hopefully that will happen sometime in the foreseeable future. And it will be great to see more of you in person.
Congratulations to everybody for a great book. I look forward to seeing how it does out in the real world.
Okay.
So thanks everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone. Good to see you people.